In the last episode, we saw the birth of the Kamakura shogunate as Minamoto no Yoritomo strived to tie up loose ends following the Genpei War on his path to cementing ultimate military rule over Japan. To this end, he had to deal with his brother, the war hero Minamoto no Yoshitsune, who would at last be betrayed and killed in 1189. With this, the stage was set for Yoritomo to assume the title of Sei Taishogun in 1192, following the death of the retired emperor Go-Shirakawa, thus transforming his regime into the first great shogunate. Yet, Yoritomo's sudden death in 1199 all but paved the way for the rise of his wife's family, the Hojo, as over the following decades they would assume control of the Bakufu as powerful regent lords. Now, decades later into the Kamakura period, we will witness the first major attack by an outside threat, as the mighty Mongol empire of Kublai Khan will set his eyes upon Japan. As we tread into the 13th century, the power of the Hojo Regency was on the rise. Being the true rulers of the military government that was the Kamakura Bakufu, they came to install each successive shogun and managed affairs throughout the many provinces across Japan. In Kyoto, the real central government still existed, ran by an emperor and an imperial court, but as we previously saw, their reach had become far more limited, as the shogunate held most power in the land. Although there was cooperation between both the Bakufu and the court, tensions were steadily rising. Over time, the court began to rightly view their own roles as diminishing, and the frustration was only compounded by disagreements and occasionally violent actions. It was only 2 years after the death of Shogun Minamoto no Sanetomo that we see a major uprising occur. As we had previously discussed, Sanetomo's assassination in 1219 had been a defining moment which only furthered the efforts of the Hojo Regency to take control of matters directly. It would be they who would truly come to seize the reins of the military government in Kamakura, and thus exert a tremendous amount of authority across Japan. Yet a challenge to their power would arise in 1221 when the retired emperor Go-Toba began an organized attempt to overthrow the Bakufu. He managed to rally an army of supporters who were already displeased with the Kamakura government, figures from branches of the Taira family, distant lords of the west who did not feel recognized by the new regime, and monasteries throughout central Japan who held true to their traditional loyalties to the emperor. Together, they formed a formidable force, an army with which to topple the shogunate. However, it was soon seen how outmatched they really were. Within a week of learning of Go-Toba's rebellion, the Hojo had begun to muster a powerful army of their own. Some estimations have placed the total figure of this force to be perhaps over 100,000, which is almost certainly an exaggeration, yet we do know it was only set to grow as the army marched its way towards Kyoto, taking on more warriors as they went. Go-Toba's loyalists were utterly crushed, and Kyoto was seized by the shogunate. In the aftermath, Go-Toba himself would be sent into exile, along with other supporters who faced death or banishment for their rebellion, along with the confiscation of any lands they owned. Yet the real consequence of the war was that now the shogunate had a reason to stay in Kyoto, whereas before they had largely kept themselves separate in their own capital far to the east in the Kanto. The Bakufu would establish the Rokuhara Tandai, an office which allowed them to oversee the affairs of the imperial capital, as well as allowing them to take a more active role in the decision-making of the court. By all means, this was an effort by the Hojo Regency to clamp down on the imperial city. So, as we can see, although Go-Toba had sought to end the influence of the shogunate, in actuality the failure of his rebellion led to an even greater assertion of Bakufu power across Japan, as now they came to more effectively dominate the government as a whole. For decades following Go-Toba's rebellion, which would come to be remembered as the Jokyu War, the country came to enjoy a period of relative peace. Under the iron grip of the shogunate, stability was felt far and wide. Had life gone on like this, uninterrupted, it is interesting to think how it may have affected the grand trajectory of the period. Yet we know that was not to be the case. Several decades of peace is nothing to gawk at, as it was soon to be upended by a threat from beyond the seas of all places. In 1271, Kublai, who was the Mongol emperor and grandson of the great Genghis or Genghis Khan, established a powerful new authority in China, the Yuan dynasty. He had done so by supplanting the previous Song dynasty, pushing them to the south where they would later be destroyed. Through the various subordinate Mongol states and vassal kingdoms, Kublai's empire had come to stretch all the way from Korea to the Middle East and even into Europe. Yet, one place which eluded his reach was that of Japan, just beyond his shores. It is not entirely understood why Kublai came to desire Japan to be part of his empire. While a simple explanation could be his lust to rule over as much as he possibly could, there have been more sophisticated theories pondered over the years. Some have asserted it was Kublai's lust for Japanese gold and riches that propelled his attack, such as hinted at in the writings of the famous explorer Marco Polo. Yet, as historian Thomas Conlan has described, Kublai's intentions might have more to do with wider political implications seen throughout Asia at the time. By the late 1260s, Kublai would send a missive to Japan, one which has become famous due to the wording it used and how it was interpreted. On one hand, it can be viewed as a threat, propping up the might of Kublai and his Mongol empire and asking the Japanese to surrender to his benevolent rule. While on the other hand, some historians have instead come to simply view it as a request for continued peace between their peoples. I'll let you decide for yourself. It went like this. From the Emperor of Greater Mongolia to the King of Japan. From time immemorial, rulers of small states have sought to maintain friendly relations with one another. We, the great Mongolian Empire, have received the mandate of heaven and have become master of the universe. Therefore, innumerable states in far-off lands have longed to form ties with us. As soon as I ascended the throne, I ceased fighting with Koryu and restored their land and people. In gratitude, both the ruler and the people of Koryu came to us to become our subjects. Their joy resembles that of children with their father. Japan is located near Koryu, and since its founding has on several occasions sent envoys to the Middle Kingdom. However, this has not happened since the beginning of my reign. This must be because you are not fully informed. Therefore, I hereby send you a special envoy to inform you of our desire. From now on, let us enter into friendly relations with each other. Nobody would wish to resort to arms. As you can see, this initial letter can definitely be interpreted in different ways. And while yes, the undertones are evident, showcasing the Mongolian desire to appear as all-powerful and how it is in Japan's best interest to fall in line with other smaller states, while also asserting that the Japanese emperor is not an emperor at all and is in fact just a king, in truth, like I mentioned before, all Kublai might be really asking for here is just a continued peace. Now, as we know, Japan had no intentions at this time of mingling in the affairs of the mainland, but as far as Kublai was concerned, he didn't want that to change. This is what Thomas Conlan explained about the letter and Kublai's potential intentions in his book, In Little Need of Divine Intervention, which details the truth of the Mongol invasions of Japan as seen through contemporary war scrolls. Concern over the balance of power in East Asia may have played a role in the timing of this dispatch. When Kublai sent this document to Japan, his predecessor had only recently subjugated the Korean kingdom of Koryu after 30 years of warfare, and he himself was about to engage in a campaign to conquer the southern Song. Because Koryo had relatively friendly relations with Japan, providing supplies and transportation home for castaways, Kublai attempted to draw Japan into his orbit by using this friendship as the basis for contact, in order to prevent them from aiding the southern Song. And perhaps there was some justification behind Kublai's fears about Japan. Japan had held some level of diplomatic contact with the Song, so when the Mongols entered into conflict against the Song likely painted a very negative picture of the Mongols to them. All the Japanese likely knew about the Mongol Empire was that it was a great threat on the mainland. But that also doesn't mean that the Japanese would just as readily send troops to engage in a foreign war. Now, it appears the imperial court likely felt the most fear from the Mongol letter, understanding the great weight behind it and the potential implication it had of a full-scale invasion. However, the Hojo Regency had an entirely different reaction, as the 8th Shikain, or regent of the Bakufu, Hojo Tokimune, would ultimately decide to completely ignore the letter and send no response. Now, Hojo Tokimune was only a teenager at the time when the letter was received, yet in time he would come to be known as perhaps the greatest of the Hojo regents, exhibiting qualities of a competent politician, a stoic defender of the nation in the face of the Mongol invasion, and even a religious icon, becoming a devout Zen Buddhist who was instructed by Chinese priests who had come to Japan from the southern Song. Upon receiving the Mongol missive, what likely struck Tokimune as well as other ranking figures within the Bakufu was the arrogance with which it addressed the Japanese, immediately equating them as lesser by denoting the ruler of Japan as only a king, while Kublai himself was a real emperor. Such posturing was likely taken by the proud warriors of Kamakura as insolence and was rightfully disregarded. If Kublai really wanted to have any influence in Japan, the Mongols would have to come there themselves and face the Japanese, warrior to warrior. Now, if Kublai was a paranoid man, he might have come to suspect that potential fears may be true about the Japanese aiding the southern Song, which he hoped to soon destroy. Why else would they ignore such a generous offer of friendship, he might have thought, unless they were already or soon to be in league with his enemy. Soon, Kublai began to tire of their silence, taking it as an insult and perhaps a potential threat. By 1268, he ordered the construction of a massive fleet, one which could be used to invade Japan. Korea was the main staging point for such an operation and had become the primary intermediary for conducting discourse between Japan and the Mongol Empire. When the order came through to prepare a fleet, it caused brewing tension in Korea to erupt into a full-scale rebellion against their Mongol overlords. It would be these Korean rebels who would warn the Japanese of the looming Mongol invasion, in hopes that the Japanese would send military support. However, support never came, as the issue became a disputed topic within the Japanese imperial court. By 1271, the same year as the founding of Kublai's new Yuan dynasty, he would crush the uprising in Korea. Despite his preparing for war, Kublai wasn't simply going to order an attack of such scale after one ignored message. Thus, he would make several more attempts, hoping that the Japanese would come to their senses and any conflict could be avoided if possible. Time and time again, the Bakufu refused to respond, denying any establishment of cordial diplomatic relations. Instead, the Bakufu responded by bolstering their own defenses, making ready for whatever attack may soon be upon them. Japan continued to ignore Mongol envoys, but at the same time, the Kamakura Bakufu began warning warriors throughout the land that a Mongol attack was imminent. Kamakura, too, took the lead in organizing defense efforts against the foreign invaders by dispatching its warriors to the western island of Kyushu. Conversely, the Mongols embarked on an amphibious invasion of Koryo's southernmost island in 1273 and stamped out the final pockets of resistance to their rule. With the successful breach of a major defensive line of the southern Song that same year, Kublai could now afford to dispatch an army to conquer Japan. The initial assault would come in 1274. The size of the Mongol invasion force can vary depending on different records, yet some estimates place the numbers at around potentially 15,000 soldiers from Yuan and a further 8,000 from Korea. In total, some 23,000 men, which may not appear to be much, Yet to face them, records indicate that the Japanese, on the other hand, had perhaps only as many as 6,000 warriors ready to meet them in Kyushu. As we know, the first stop on the Mongol campaign was the island of Tsushima, which lay between Korea and Japan. It was here the Mongols utterly crushed the So clan at the Battle of Komoda Beach, and very quickly went on to seize the island before moving on to Iki. On Iki, Taira Kagetaka, upon hearing of the devastation of Tsushima, attempted to bolster his defenses, but it was all in vain. Iki was soon overrun, and Kagetaka would fall back to his castle, where he would kill himself and his family to avoid capture. There were, however, those who managed to escape, fleeing to Kyushu, where they warned of the imminent attack. They must have also spoke of the brutality exhibited by the Mongol forces, who according to some records took such hostile measures as to slaughter many of the surviving men on the islands, while piercing the hands of women and tying them to the sides of their ships. Within a few days, Mongol forces began probing the Japanese coastline. Japanese naval forces did not attempt to engage the vast Mongol fleet, likely because of the futility of such an action, eventually allowing the Mongol invasion force to amass at Hakata Bay in the province of Chikuzen. This was near Dazaifu, which was an administrative center in Kyushu. It was here many of the local samurai clans of the island, such as the Shoni and the Otomo, had gathered their forces in anticipation of the looming attack. As the Mongols came ashore, battle was joined. Now, much has been said over the years regarding the status of both forces, with the picture often being painted that the Japanese methods of fighting were far inferior to that of the Mongol invaders from the mainland. Yet, contemporary sources conflict with this notion, portraying a different point of view. Indeed, the Japanese were met with some difficulty in their initial encounters. Logically, they would, as one learns how to effectively meet an unfamiliar foe. The Mongols coordinated their cohesive units through gongs and drums. Their troops were not so tightly packed as to present a solid wall, thereby causing horses to shy away, but they were grouped closely enough to be able to use hooks and other weapons to pull charging Japanese warriors from their mounts. Thus we can see, taking the Mongols head-on proved difficult, but as we are also aware, Japanese warriors were well known to be skilled archers. This leads to a reliance on more skirmish tactics in order to withstand the Mongol advance. Harrying the enemy from afar proved to be far more effective a stratagem than engaging them in a frontal assault. For example, one Japanese warrior named Yamada sensibly preferred picking off scattered soldiers. Both the Japanese and Mongol accounts refer to the prowess of Japanese archers. Shoni Kagesuke, for example, was lauded by the Mongols as a warrior adept in horsemanship and archery because he shot the Mongol commander Liu Fuxiong in the face and captured his horse. From this episode alone, one can infer that the skirmishing skill of the Mongols and the Japanese were roughly comparable. What also came to play a crucial role was that of the defensive fortifications that the Japanese had erected around Dazaifu. These positions were difficult for the Mongols to take, as entrenched Japanese forces resisted their efforts. Faced with mounting casualties, the Mongols were forced to fall back after a hard day of fighting around the 20th of October. Likely fearing the potential of a Japanese night attack, the Mongols chose not to stay in their own encamped positions, but instead to return to the safety of their ships, not before completely burning Hakata to the ground. It was on this night, however, that some sort of weather-related incident occurred, and I say weather-related incident because it is really not clear at all what happened. The popular story is that a great typhoon arrived and wreaked havoc on the Mongol navy, forcing the survivors to abandon the invasion. Yet that does not appear to be what really happened, as contemporary sources just refer to the weather that night as having a reverse wind. This did not destroy a large portion of the Mongol fleet, but instead was simply recorded to have beached several of their vessels, allowing the Japanese to capture their crews. However, it did provide for a convenient end to the conflict for both parties. For the Mongols, it allowed the remaining invasion force to return back to Korea, having learned much from their first encounter with the Japanese, perhaps considering the entire campaign as a large probing effort with which to gain the knowledge necessary to begin planning a second greater invasion. And for the Japanese, it was seen as divine intervention, an answer to their many prayers and offerings. Yet, more tangibly, the invasion had allowed the Japanese to also learn more about their enemy and how to better face them, if or when they returned. What was seen as key were the defenses constructed, ones which the Mongols could not overcome. Thus, the Bakufu ordered the construction of large stone walls along the coast, perhaps similar to earlier fortifications the Japanese had once built centuries earlier when they had previously feared an attack from the mainland. There was a brief conversation about the Japanese potentially launching their own invasion of Korea in retaliation, yet such an effort never materialized. The Bakufu did its best to bolster their forces, while also planning for the potential of a second invasion landing elsewhere in Japan. There was even the fear that the Mongols might try to land closer to Kyoto in an effort to seize the imperial city and maybe even capture the emperor himself. Vigilance and preparedness was key. Yet for Kublai, he would once again first attempt diplomacy. By the mid-1270s, he would begin sending more envoys to Japan, the first of which explained the obvious, that now since the Japanese and Mongols had met on the battlefield, the Japanese knew what to expect, and that a much larger attack would soon be sent should Japan not back down. The Bakufu's reply to this was simple and bloody. They decapitated the messengers and displayed their heads in the streets of Kamakura. And thus, later attempts at diplomacy by the Mongols were simply met with this level of immediate hostility, supposedly, in one instance, executing the emissaries as soon as they took their first step on Japanese soil. By 1279, Kublai had at last finished off his conquest of the southern Song. This was followed by his final message to the Japanese, this time using the weight of his victory as his last threat in aims to force the Japanese to submit. For if the Song had fallen, how was Japan to ever survive against Kublai's full might? The Japanese, of course, remained undeterred, ready to face the Mongols yet again should they attempt another invasion. The second of the Mongol attempts to seize Japan would come in 1281, and although significantly larger than the first invasion, one could judge the results of this second attempt as pathetic. But how was that so? How could a larger invasion and one using the knowledge that they acquired from the first invasion end so horribly for the attackers? Well, it all comes down to the preparedness of the Japanese, who had learned far more and had readied themselves far better. For the second invasion, the Mongol plan was similar to the first assault, but with the added forces coming from southern China, which had only recently been conquered. This would lead to the formation of two divisions, a northern division departing from Korea and a southern division departing from Changnan. It is hard to judge the number of troops the Mongols would field this time around. However, some estimates have put the combined forces of the Mongol, Yuan, Korean, and southern Chinese forces at perhaps well over 100,000 strong, which would be an incredible number and one which would require thousands of ships just in order to transport. As for the Japanese, the number would have grown perhaps into the tens of thousands, but would have been also more spread out, as like we previously discussed, it was not known if the Mongols would attempt a landing at the same location, which is exactly what they would end up doing. Just as in the first invasion, the northern division departing from Korea would attack both Tsushima and Iki, which, like before, were easily overrun. However, it is then that things began to change. The initial plan appears to have been for the northern division to await the arrival of the southern division at Iki before carrying on to attack Kyushu. Yet the northern division went on regardless before the southern division showed up. They would be the first to realize that they now faced new obstacles, possibly not considered beforehand. At first, the attackers made their way back to Hakata Bay, where the first invasion had landed. But this time, the coastal defenses the Japanese had built in the time since the first invasion were too much for the Mongols to deal with. There may have indeed been attempts to make a landing, but they inevitably failed, as unable to advance past the Japanese wall, the defenders pushed the Mongol forces back into the sea. And this is where another new tactic would emerge. During the first invasion, as we saw, the Japanese Navy played really no role. Yet this time, the Japanese adopted a different approach. Realizing they could not match the size of the Mongol vessels and the scale of the Mongol fleet in a straight-up attack, the Japanese instead implemented tactics far more suited to what their ships could accomplish. With the Mongols being unable to land and thus pulling away from the shore, Japanese warriors poured into smaller boats and began to harass the larger Mongol vessels. They began targeting specific Mongol ships as the Japanese warriors jumped aboard to slay crews and set fire to what remained. With the smaller Japanese boats being swifter and more agile than the Mongol vessels, they were able to strike portions of the disarrayed Mongol fleet before retreating back to safety. This was not something it appeared the Mongols had ever anticipated and were caught off guard by the boldness of such an attack. All in all, this initial attempt by the Northern Division was met with devastating results, losing precious manpower and ships in the process. They had no other choice than to return back to Iki and await the Southern Division. Finally, the Southern Division would arrive, bolstering the Mongol numbers. With the Grand Army assembled, they would make one more attempt to secure a beachhead. This time, they chose to attack further south along Hizen Province, trying to land near Takashima Island. However, despite their overwhelming number, the Japanese continued to thwart their efforts to make a solid landing. Unable to breach Japanese fortifications, losing hundreds if not thousands of men on the beaches, and then being counterattacked at sea, the Mongols were once again left with little other options than to break off the attack. There may have been plans to try yet again, but as we know, by late summer, a typhoon would arrive to completely put an end to their effort. This time, the storm does appear to have been far more of an actually recorded disaster, supposedly wrecking a large portion of the Mongol fleet, more so than the weather incident which occurred at the end of the first invasion. Now, with a significant portion of their fleet destroyed, many of their men already dead, supplies dwindling, and no real headway to show for it, the second invasion came to an end as the remaining Mongol forces returned to the mainland. Supposedly, Kublai did plan for there to be a third invasion attempt, yet his focus was divided across his empire, and ultimately he would die in 1294 before ever committing to another attack, and his successors would never try again. Some have come to say that this defeat was perhaps the greatest that the Mongol Empire would ever suffer. In the aftermath, some Japanese began to view outsiders with suspicion, and some anti-foreign sentiment began to arise, although not widespread. This can be especially seen in how the Japanese treated Mongol prisoners of war, as faced with earlier atrocities the Mongols had committed on the outlying islands they had seized. The Japanese responded by executing nearly all of the Mongol forces who were captured or surrendered. As for the storms themselves, as we know, the myths would soon arise that they were all sent from the gods to end the threat on Japan. Elites in Kyoto and warriors alike had taken measures to pray and submit offerings to appease their deities in hopes that they would defend Japan from the Mongol invasion. And surprisingly enough, they appeared to receive an answer in the form of the storms that would appear at the end of both invasion attempts. These would come to be dubbed as the Divine Wind, or Kamikaze. The shogunate would only years later hop on the bandwagon and begin to issue nationwide prayers. What else is interesting, though, is that it is not just the Japanese who felt that the gods had intervened in their favor, as the Mongols themselves began to use this as a convenient excuse as to why they too were defeated. However, this then conflicts with their earlier assertion that they had received the mandate of heaven and had become masters of the universe. For if they truly had received the mandate of heaven and become masters of the universe, then the idea that they were defeated by divine forces would upend such a notion. But regardless of what anyone wants to say about the possibility of divine intervention saving Japan in the form of great typhoons smashing the Mongol navy, it is important to understand the truth of the matter, that it is clear to see how the Japanese themselves were more than capable at defending their homeland from the invaders without the need of godly assistance. Yet this has been forgotten, cast aside by the great legend of Heaven's will that not just the Japanese, but also the Mongols themselves continued to propagate over the years. The 13th century Japanese did not perceive superior tactics or cunning strategies as the ultimate cause of victory. Other sources suggest that the Japanese provided stiff resistance to the Mongols. Nevertheless, even those who fought with considerable skill attributed their success to the gods. Japan was saved, but it was also changed. The seeds were planted of Japanese nationhood, and that Japan itself existed as a land favored by the gods. And while the Bakufu itself had been so instrumental in organizing the forces that would defend Japan and actually defeat the Mongols, they emerged from the conflict with brewing trouble on the horizon. There were already those spread across the country who were not content with the status quo put forth by Kamakura, and when brave warriors went off to fight the Mongols in service of the shogun, they did so with the notion that they would be receiving reward for their efforts, as most warriors do. Yet the Mongols were an external threat, thus no land had been gained in their defeat, no land that could be awarded to the victorious heroes who helped to save the country. If the Bakufu could not be counted on to properly compensate those in service, what good was there in serving it in the first place? Cracks in the system were starting to form, cracks which would eventually come to shatter the military government. It would have been hard for the shogunate to imagine that such a great victory would also cause their own demise in the century to come. In the next episode, we finish off this updated series as the Kamakura Bakufu is set to fall and a new shogunate will come to rise. Yet with it, Japan will fall into an age of war which will divide the nation. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.